Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our second podcast of the Beyond Data podcast hosted by Colligo and VMware. Um, if you like what you hear, both in the first episode and this episode, please click the link here and subscribe to our episodes so that you can receive email updates when we have new releases and be given some interesting follow-up content around the topics. Today we have with us Clayton Tino. He's got a very interesting background. Currently, he's a leader in the product and software development world, supporting the adoption of transformative technologies, doing some really interesting things. His background is in aerospace engineering and systems design optimization. He's currently the CTO of RideBeep, which is an autonomous vehicle company in the US. We thought it'd be great to bring Clayton on to talk about autonomous vehicles, what they are, how they kind of function, and get into the nitty gritty of privacy, surveillance, and all the surrounding components of autonomous vehicles. And we're really happy to have you here today, Clayton. Do you want to give us a little bit of a sense of, before we get started, like your journey in life, how you got where you are? And
Sure, yeah, happy to do that. Like you mentioned, I have a fairly broad background that's taken a kind of a couple interesting turns. So, to your point, I went to school, have probably too many degrees in aerospace engineering, ultimately culminated in a PhD in systems design and optimization from Georgia Tech. And really the focus of my time there, really kind of the early stages of my career, was primarily around kind of algorithm development for air traffic management. It's been a goal of the US for I think probably 25, 30 years at this point to move to what they call next gen airspace. That's essentially the idea that every single vehicle in the sky can have its entire path kind of pre-managed and planned. So the whole concept of we know where everything is going to be at a future point in time, and we can therefore optimize the behavior of the airspace. Still working on that today. I don't think we're quite there yet. It's going to be a long problem that I think continues to see research for the next 20, 30 years. But coming out of my PhD, I took a bit of a detour, decided to take an entrepreneurial chance and joined a small startup in the cloud computing space. Spent about 8 years doing a variety of functions with that company. Started off as a kind of pure R&D resource, really looking at algorithm development for how we manage, ironically enough, workload placement on VMware managed platforms. So very familiar with VMware, especially the first part of my professional career building VMware enabled clouds. Then moved into kind of generalized engineering leadership and ultimately product leadership, running essentially a little self-contained service line of business to deliver VMware on public cloud. So had an interesting kind of detour there. Eventually left that business after we exited a few times and have since been kind of called back to join Beep. Beep, to your point, is an autonomous mobility services startup headquartered in Orlando, Florida. And it's a really convoluted way of saying that we work with private developers and public transportation providers to ultimately implement usable transportation services using AVs. So, it's kind of an interesting transition to go back from cloud now back into something that's more kind of vehicle controls focused. But, I like to say that I learned learned the lessons required to really grow a technology organization at scale during my detour, and now I get to apply a bit more of my kind of foundational knowledge in my new role.
so that's fascinating. Yeah, it's a long journey, a nice journey. Found your way back. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's like people ask like, how'd you end up where you are? I was like, well, opportunities present themselves or doors present themselves. You just pick which one to walk through and hope you make the best of it. And it's been a successful approach to this time. To this point, I've really enjoyed kind of my journey and what I've been able to not just achieve, but really learn. I think joining Beep specifically has been kind of a completely different application for some of the skills I might have learned in school. Airspace is incredibly structured. It's very well controlled and has always been. I'm sure you can look out your window and into the scenes of traffic going on outside and realize that, people don't behave rationally when they drive. There's a level of trust you have getting on a commercial flight that everything's well structured and planned and the pilots can act in your best interest. I know sitting in traffic in Atlanta on a regular basis that no one has my best interest in mind.
Right.
The interesting thing transitioning into the AV space, I think something that's important that Beep does a little bit differently is that all of our deployments are on public roadways. So all of the vehicles we deploy and make available to the public they're not, demonstration POCs, kind of research experiments. We run a 7-day-a-week transportation service for our customers that is available and open to the public. So again, if you think about kind of the realities of putting that kind of technology on a roadway with other drivers, it took me a while to get comfortable with it, but I think we've have a lot of operational rigor and frankly pre-planning work in terms of how we ensure a safe operating environment for all of our passengers.
Sure. So one thing I've been curious about, because when I look at like just the technical descriptions of autonomous vehicles, it's not really binary. It's not like you are autonomous or you're not. There's like these gradations of autonomy, right? Where, I know even my car, like I can, it does the lane detection and the auto braking. And so there's that level of autonomy. And then there's, you don't need to have a driver at all and under standard conditions, and then there's no driver under all conditions. And
Sure.
like curious to hear about like where you think we are in general, both in terms of in general in terms of autonomous vehicles and what we've been able to achieve on that scale of autonomy.
Yeah, so you're referring to what they call the SAE levels, or the Society of Automotive Engineering SAE levels of autonomy. And there's essentially a 5-tier model that describes maturity of autonomy and autonomous technologies as they apply to automotive or to vehicles specifically. To your point, lane keeping, adaptive cruise control, or what they call advanced driver assist solutions or systems, ADAS systems, level 3, 2+, level 3, kind of like bridge the gap there. When most people think of an autonomous vehicle, they think of a robo-taxi, right? To where you call it on your phone, whether it's Uber or Lyft, pick your ride-hailing app of choice, pulls up, you get in, and it drives off and takes you where you want to go. That's really the nirvana everyone envisions, SAE level 5. Anytime, any place, no restrictions on the environment the vehicle can operate in. Personally, I think we're a ways away from that, from ever really seeing that future. I'm still waiting on my Tesla to take me from San Francisco to New York without me having to touch the steering wheel. But I think we're still a few years off of that benchmark, although I think that was 2019, 3 years behind. But if you start to back it off then a little bit, you get kind of downgraded to what we consider true autonomy for the sense of what's applicable today, and that's SAE level 4. And that's the notion that you can have a vehicle that within a certain environment can operate without a human on board. So there's a lot of pre-planning work. So in terms of defining that operational environment, or ODD, so operational design domain. But we're really achieving that level of autonomy today in limited use cases. You're seeing groups like Waymo and Cruise start to test out those use cases in very limited deployments. And Beep is working towards that capability in the next probably 18 to 24 months with the vehicle platforms we deploy. Again, not any place, any time, very structured environments and conditions, reduced speeds, known pathways, kind of known environments. But that's reasonably where we are now, being able to get towards SAE level 4 level autonomy, or essentially autonomy with known limitations.
A fairly good description of public transport generally, buses,
It is.
trams. Whether there's a human there or not, they follow a certain route and they have a certain environment. And so, we're talking public transport style rather than personal vehicle style.
Yeah, we can, you can really take that one of two ways, right? I think if you look at kind of what a robo-taxi style form factor could provide today, and I think that's where a lot of people get confused. They think public transit and they think a big bus, right? So I'm not necessarily just talking about a 40-foot bus. They see a small vehicle the size of a taxi and assume, oh, what's a robo-taxi going to where I want? Realistically, though, it's going to be operating in some fixed geofenced area with a really, really well-known, well-defined environment, right? And we're getting down to not just things like it has to stay in this lane, but is there sufficient cellular coverage? What's the weather? What's the traffic environment around the vehicle? What's the pedestrian environment like? There are a variety of models that can be used to kind of describe and build up that environment. One of the, I think, more structured approaches in the world is the German process, the Pegasus model, that really talks about building layers down to like surface type, lane markings, curb markings, so all the way up to really add structure to what that looks like. But to your point, fixed route or geofenced and hyper-localized areas where you can build a very accurate model of the environment, and then from that perspective, evaluate the ADS or the automated driving system against scenarios you would expect to encounter in that environment. It's not an issue of the vehicle not being able to steer in certain conditions or not being able to react necessarily to an issue on the roadway. but it's really validating from a functional safety perspective that you have captured everything you expect the vehicle to have encountered, and to a provable degree, understand the vehicle can handle situations that it's going to be presented with.
Kind of
So
the
would you say it's
digital version of the hazard perception test.
Yeah, same thing.
so would you say it's like a fair statement that like the hurdle from getting to the more sophisticated, even 4 and 5 levels, is largely in the realm of what technology, image recognition, LiDAR, different systems you use to read the environment and being able to process the information in a way that you can respond. And that, can you talk a little bit about what the main hurdles are in terms of like pushing the bounds on what we can achieve in autonomy?
It's a really, really comprehensive question. So I'll try to hit some high points, right?
Sure.
And I'll speak to it from our perspective. I'm not going to speak to it from, I'm not an expert in everything, every single thing that every other autonomy provider is doing.
Yeah.
But, the things we typically see really starting kind of, I'll say 3 tiers, right? The first is just the base vehicle platform. We are entering a market that is used to a certain form factor, right? We're looking at 10 to 15 passengers, if not larger. So kind of multi-passenger or multi-party transportation use cases. Not a lot of vehicles in that space actually that are ready fit for autonomy. So if you look at kind of what goes on with the majority of the autonomy testing today, Waymo is a good example, or what Ford's doing with Argo AI. They're taking existing mass-produced vehicle platforms and retrofitting them for autonomy, right? So if you think through kind of vehicle dynamics that are required, braking response, steering response, and this is not really just about driving the vehicle, but if you think through what you do as a human driver, right? You're on the interstate, you have pretty good visibility up ahead, you see brake lights 100 yards in the head, 100 yards down the roadway. You start to decelerate, right? A sane person does. You take your foot off, you start to reduce your speed. If you're a defensive driver, you anticipate braking. Not all vehicles, not all ADS or automated driving solutions have that level of kind of insight, or we'll call it intuitive driving, if you will. So even at the base vehicle level, things like harsh braking is a real challenge, right? How do you guarantee that an autonomous driving system can give the brake response needed to resolve a situation? Maybe there's an obstacle in the roadway or something runs out in front of the vehicle without being a dangerous situation. Looking at maximum jerk rate, so the acceleration of the deceleration, if you will, so that it's not a kind of whiplash-inducing effect every time you need to slam on the brakes. The other aspects around really just the resiliency of that base vehicle platform. Think about the use case where you're driving and say your brakes fail. What would you do as a driver if your brakes fail?
Oh my God.
There's a big campaign over here in the UK about what you do, right? On this, you steer to the left as much as you can, and literally there's a big campaign about it right now.
Steer to the left as much as you can?
Well, off
Remember,
the road.
we drive the opposite side of the road.
Oh, right. Yeah. I'm on the other side of the world, so yeah, okay.
So if you think about that, though, if you have a vehicle platform, the brakes fail, the ADS doesn't necessarily understand what to do. It's typically not going to steer to left, as an example, or steer into a barrier. So looking at things like redundant braking systems, redundant steering systems, those capabilities to account for the fact that you don't have a higher order human being saying, how do I resolve this unforeseen situation? It's kind of really the next step of what's going on in that lower tier vehicle layer. So having a vehicle that supports the type of driving dynamics you need with an automated driving system, and secondly, the level of redundancy required to, once you remove the human from the vehicle, ensure that you can safely operate. Now, from an autonomy perspective, that's a really big question based on how the autonomy stack works. There are lots and lots of different approaches. Most of the vehicles we deploy today rely very heavily on a priori maps. So a lot of effort is put into essentially modeling a very high resolution 3D image of the environment, for lack of a better way of putting it, with metadata around what's going on in that environment. That's a fairly, I won't say expensive process, but comprehensive process to understand the environment the vehicle is going to be operating in. Not every solution takes that approach. We have like the Tesla style solutions, which are primarily intuitive based on image recognition technologies. But I think when we get into that tier in terms of what the challenges of technologies are, there are sensor issues, right? Can you have LiDAR with sufficient scanning horizon to guarantee that you pick up, a child, as an example, of a certain height if you have enough scan lines at a certain distance doing a certain speed? That's one consideration. The other is kind of the difference between false negatives and false positives with image recognition technologies, right? False positives are not a big deal because you're going to brake if you have a braking system that's not extremely harsh, right? That said, missing an object is a huge challenge, obviously. So, how we get over that hump of kind of the quality of sensor systems today, but more importantly, how they feed into perception systems is another issue. And then lastly, from an operational perspective, which is really where kind of BEEP enters the stack, if you look at the money in autonomy today, it's nearly exclusively flowing into that automated driving system tier, right? Billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars developing automated driving systems. The challenge is that's just one part of the story. During COVID, I don't know why this became a focus during COVID specifically, but I did a lot of interviews and then kind of roundtable type discussions on Zoom while everybody was trying to figure out how to make themselves productive remotely, and people really started getting on school buses, right? Wouldn't it be great if we could just automate school buses and we wouldn't have to worry about people not being able to pick up kids or kids not having lunch delivered? And my first thought process was a school bus driver, the last thing they're probably focused on is driving the vehicle, right? I mean, you've got kids in the back of the bus, like, Harry's poking Sally in the side and won't sit down. And you've got that one kid who won't stop trying to open the emergency exit in the back. So, when we think about what's truly required to enable scale mass transportation or scale public transit, a city bus driver does a heck of a lot more than just drive the bus, right? It's your passenger safety and security, it's passenger assistance. If we think about disabled passengers, or if we start to go into issues with fare enforcement, as an example, it's a bunch of other things that have to happen to actually run a meaningful transportation service. That's really the third frontier and where BEEP focuses. We assume that there's going to be some advancement over automated driving systems in the next, realistically, probably 5 to 10 years, where it becomes more meaningfully accessible to everyday people. We're focused on how do we actually take that technology for driving the car and actually making it useful in the grander context, right? How can I run a multi-passenger shared transportation solution, do so with safety in mind, understanding that we can handle in-cabin issues, understanding the operational concept around how we provide an end-to-end service and ensure resiliency and reliability. And then lastly, how do we handle all those things that everybody else is not focused on? That's kind of really come into play.
Yeah, I think before I heard any of that, I think my assumption was that public transport autonomy would be almost a little bit easier because it has more standard conditions or standard routes, standard all that. But really what you're describing is a whole different layer I hadn't even really considered in terms of the importance of the complexity of how you make it truly autonomous, in the sense of not having a bus driver in your example.
It's an interesting use case, right? I mean, if you get on a city bus today and you don't pay your fare, they just kick you off the bus, right? It's a pretty simple thing. And there are different ways to handle that. For subways, as an example, where you can get through the turnstile, but if you ride past your zone and you get caught by the roaming ticket police, you're gonna pay a fine. We really haven't kind of bridged the two together to figure out what that looks like, right? So what do you do when that bus driver is not there at point of sale or point of entry to say, hey, you haven't paid your fare? Do you rely on roving ticket maids, if you will, to say, let me see everybody's ticket when you get to a stop? Do you gate entry to the vehicle? Do you have the vehicle sit there till everybody? There's just a host of challenges that we haven't thought through. And
even the more mundane. I live in London. The bus is one of the main methods of transportation. One of the things you see not irregularly is disputes between wheelchair users and pram users for the same space. Because a mother with a pram wants to use the same space as the wheelchair. And actually, it's one of the major things our bus drivers do, is settle that dispute.
I hadn't thought of that one yet. I'll add that to our use case list of things to overcome. I'm not gonna talk to you anymore. It's just more work on my plate. No, but it's a valid point, though, right? The bulk of autonomy from our perspective today is geared around that Uber use case or the Lyft use case, right? I call a car on my phone, it picks me up, I control my ride. It's a single occupant, single destination trip. And if you think about what it takes to apply autonomy, which from my perspective can be a great enabler of public transportation, specifically in the US, where, I don't think anybody's going to argue that access to transportation in the US is a challenge. But we have to approach it in a meaningful way that's not just a one-shot solution or kind of framed towards again, that single rider robotaxi use case. We have to provide a complete capability into the market that allows public transit providers to be successful, and more importantly, enables their passengers to get where they need to go safely.
So if we can just go back for a little bit, because there's this question in my brain around the standard versus non-standard conditions, and technically what that is. Does it really come down to, because in my brain, all the other things aside around the complexities of the operational components, does it come down to having enough acquired data of unique situations? Is that kind of what it comes down to in terms of being able to train the systems to respond to diverse environments, or am I being overly narrow in the complexity of that problem?
I don't know that it's just about, so we can separate that to a variety of topics, right? There's just the pure sensing and perception side. So do you have enough training data to consistently identify that a crosswalk is a crosswalk, that a stoplight's a stoplight, that a stop sign is a stop sign? And I'm reminded of that every time I try to log into something and I'm confronted with a CAPTCHA, right? Somewhere in the background, we're all training Waymo's AI to be significantly better in terms of recognizing those things on the street. But that's just one layer, right? So the image recognition, or the kind of image processing layer in terms of how a perception system understands the world around it. Now, the next kind of layer, to your point, is how do you have a database of provable scenarios, if you will, given you have a single situation, a single kind of construct of a point in time. How can you safely model the fact or guarantee the fact with some statistical confidence that you have captured every possible scenario that may be encountered, right? And that the logic you have implemented for your kind of driving system, if you will, can react to everything you expect to encounter. It's almost a problem too large to actually guarantee, right?
Yeah.
So if you start to look at things like the SOTIF process or ISO 21448, we're starting to move towards kind of a standardized risk or hazard analysis and modeling process. And how do you start to take a look at, based on what you've modeled for the environment, how do you capture on-road hazards, and then how do you assign a probability of concurrence and a risk output? And trying to build a more complete picture so there's some statistical confidence in terms of, yes, this is completely provably safe. I don't know that we'll ever get to a completely provably safe system, but we can get to some degree of confidence.
But that in itself's interesting from my perspective, in that we expect our autonomous vehicles to be guaranteed safe. We know buses, cars, any other vehicle you want to put anywhere are not 100% safe with a human behind them. So it's kind of that we have a higher expectation of what safe looks like when it's autonomous to when it's a human.
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely fair. And I think the data, if you go back and look at crash statistics and vehicle performance information, at a fundamental level, typically autonomous solutions are going to be functionally safer than a human driver. They don't get distracted. They're never impaired. They obey rules of the roadway. At a base level, that's a fundamentally true statement, I think, from my perspective. To your point, though, it's not a rational argument you make when you start talking about people's perception of autonomy and the expectations put on, frankly, a computer system versus a human driver. If I think through, what happens when someone cuts you off on the roadway, right? If I'm having a great day, I let it roll off my back, have a sip of my coffee, and continue on my trip. If I'm not having a good day, some very impolite language, like some things happen. But it's a story an anecdote to prove the point that you can identify the person who has made this thing happen, right?
Oh, we have a standing joke that I have a. Sorry, we have a standing joke that I have a 20-mile-an-hour difference between rock music and easy listening.
Absolutely. Well, but you get to the point of kind of standards and expectations. When something goes wrong or someone causes an accident, you have someone to blame, right? That's a rational thing society needs. Society needs to be able to blame someone when something happens like that. You don't really get that with autonomy, right? It's, the computer made a mistake. That makes people really uncomfortable. And because it's just such like we said, a very challenging to prove, like a comprehensive safety picture for the behavior of an autonomous vehicle, it becomes this weird issue where when there is an incident, all the statistics in the world about safety, people don't want to see, they don't want to hear, right? There's never going to be an engineering level argument that makes, someone living down the street comfortable with how the vehicle behaves. It's a gap that has to be bridged.
Well, we know this from your previous life in aerospace. There are far more people afraid of flying than there are of driving, despite the statistics. Statistics have never yet won over people.
Well, and like the 737 MAX use case is a very interesting kind of case study of that. What happens when a mechanical system goes wrong, right? Do you blame the technology? Do you blame the people? I'm not going to issue an opinion on that one, but you can go read like everything that went into that investigation, kind of see the challenges there, right? Between how people react to a situation. The immediate reaction was to blame the pilot. And it turns out that wasn't really the full picture, right? So it's a good point you raise, in terms of as autonomy becomes more widely used and accepted on roadways, how society now starts to perceive it, and kind of that threshold between whether or not it's a value add, a hindrance, is it safe, is it not safe? And I think it's entirely going to bear out based on how members like Beep, or participants in the market like Beep, present our services and the rigor we put into frankly safety and how we expect our technologies to be used.
Yeah, and I feel like with this conversation, it might be a little bit of a disservice to not at least touch on the trolley car problem, because I know I struggle with this one because the trolley car problem of I'm driving down the car and I can choose between running over one child or two adults. Let's just make it super narrow, right? And I know that like even myself, I can't make a predetermination of what I would do in that situation as a human. and,
I'm not gonna lie, I find that to be one of the irritating's not the right word. It's an interesting question people always bring up. Like, do you hit the school bus, or do you hit the mother with the stroller? And people like to think that they have a preconceived notion of how they would behave in that situation, and I just don't buy that. Like, I fundamentally don't buy that. If anyone's ever been in a high pressure situation, think about the last time you had a near miss, right? It's a purely reactive response. No one's sitting there doing rapid process. School bus, mom with stroller, old lady crossing the street. Like no one's doing that in real time.
No, I agree from my perspective I agree with you. This is the trolley car situation is always brought up when it comes to autonomous vehicles, but we mentioned earlier about the hazard perception. I use that term because that's an actual test over here when you get your driving license. If you are doing your hazard perception properly, you shouldn't get into a trolley car situation. And then again, back to that different standard of safety. I am not going to guess on how many years of driving there are on this podcast right now, but I've never been in a trolley car situation, and I'm willing to guess you two haven't either.
Oh no, I mean, I if I have to think back, to my driving experience, I think the closest thing I've had was a potential rear end collision on an interstate. I was driving in South Carolina, actually, kind of cresting over a blind hill, and traffic was dead stopped on the interstate. I was probably doing 55 miles an hour, so not extremely fast or anything, but what do you do? I mean, there's a car probably 40, 50 yards ahead, dead stopped. But what choice is there? Hard concrete barrier on one side, car in front of me, a narrow gap between two vehicles on the right? So essentially splitting a line. Slam on the brakes, ABS failed, started sliding, steered down the line of cars, right? And that wasn't oh my God, I can't rear end this person. It was just a snap decision on, how do I make the car not hit something? Like, how do I find open space and go into open space? So, I think to your point on the trolley car, it's an interesting, ethics thought exercise in terms of how do we start to develop and prioritize artificial intelligence towards thinking about those things, and can you start to think about ethics in the context of AI? Yeah, I think there's opportunity for that in the future, but is that a realistic hindrance for autonomy today? I don't think so at all.
Well, and for me, it's an interesting element, right? Because in the autonomous vehicles, you have to be able to do, have some sort of decision-making process. And I'm admitting in this moment that I don't have a clear decision-making process, which is what I also hear you saying, Clayton. So it's interesting like that.
It's like we said, we put unrealistic expectations at times on the machine because there's no human touch to it, right? Again, it's that need to be able to blame something when something goes wrong, right? So I think you have the converse of holding the machine to higher standards because we can't personify it with someone and hold them accountable.
So with the systems in public transit, so can we get a little bit into surveillance and how that works in terms of both external and internal surveillance around primarily mass transportation systems?
Yeah, so it's, I know we had a kind of a prior conversation about the difference between privacy in the US and Europe. So I can I can see Sophie's face like starting to tighten up already. But it's, if we talk about what's required to actually deliver a meaningful service, like everything we talked about earlier, particularly when it comes to passenger safety and security, right? Having a bus driver on board is a big deterrent for criminal behavior, frankly. People are less likely to vandalize, they're less likely to cause trouble if there's some notion of authority, right? And when you take that person out of their vehicle, how do you provide that same level of comfort or same level of same, I want to say guarantee, but same like safety layer, if you will, for other passengers to ensure that that's still there, right? To a degree, it's not possible to do without some level of surveillance. And we can get into a nitty-gritty debate on if metadata streaming off of smart cameras is a better solution than pure video streaming, yada yada yada. But then it gets into another AI topic and what's the validity of the AI and everything else. Fundamentally, though, I don't know that it's possible to deliver those types of use cases or to solve for that problem without having surveillance to a degree. In the U.S., surveillance for public transit is very, very common, if not the standard. I mean, every single state has policies related to data retention and privacy access, et cetera, but it's the norm. I mean, there's an expectation that if you get onto if you're in a public space, you get onto a public transportation vehicle, as an example, you're being recorded on CCTV. Now the ethics of that, I think from our perspective, we're not looking to at this point to really do anything with that information other than to satisfy the use cases we've talked about, right? Providing some level of governance over what goes on in cabin, providing some level of a little bit of protection for the operator in this case. And in the event that there is an issue, there is a liability aspect in terms of making sure you have an understanding of what happened in the event of an issue. But I think it's going to be something that we as a society have to get more comfortable with. Now, what's going to be interesting is, as the U.S. specifically starts to implement more GDPR-style laws, like we're seeing in California with CCPA, how does that start to change what we do in our end of the industry with respect to surveillance, how that information is used, and the individual's rights to frankly hold us accountable for how we manage that information? I think it's kind of an unknown frontier at this point in the U.S. at least.
No, absolutely. And don't get me wrong, even as a European, monitoring inside a vehicle for safety purposes, nope, that is reasonable, that is proportionate, that is a sensible thing to do. It's then all about the other stuff around it, as you say, how it's secured, how long it's retained for. Do you use facial recognition on it, or do you just have it in case in the background? It's those other questions around it rather than the sheer fact of monitoring, because as you say, without a human, how else do you possibly try and do safety for the passengers?
Yeah, if we think about, like, at least from my perspective, again, as an American, when I think about use of data today, I assume that if I'm not paying for something, I'm the product, right? That's just a fact
assumption.
It's a fact of life in this country, at least. And, I was in Best Buy a couple weeks ago picking up something for my wife. And, you go through the TV section, right? And you see two TVs that are notionally identical. They have the same features, the same specifications, and one is $1,000 cheaper. And then you go through and look at all of the terms and conditions associated with the television and look at the massive amount of spyware involved in terms of tracking your usage habits, looking at what you're watching, and to be able to send you like directed content. It's a choice that consumers make between lower price point, giving up some of that information and access to, frankly, their personal information in terms of their consumption habits, versus paying a higher premium to not have to do that. And I bring that up, if you think about transit today, right? Think of the last city bus you saw. There are advertisements all over the place, right? For us, it's a really interesting kind of double-edged sword, right? types of information we have access to or potentially could have access to with very robust interior monitoring of a vehicle, there's immense revenue opportunities in terms of how you can leverage that information. Now, from a pure kind of commercial perspective, it's not at all interesting to me, right? It's yes, there's another revenue stream. Great, it's another way for people to make money. At the same time, though, if we look at challenges with the proliferation of public transportation, specifically in the U.S., it's a big value add. I mean, I realize it's a vastly different perspective in the U.S. than it is in Europe, where public transportation is a fact of life. Is of course you pay for that. We have to have mobility for people. That's not necessarily the same point of view you have, especially not here in Atlanta, Georgia, where I live. So when I think through kind of the potential frontiers around information, it's a bit of I would propose it was a virtuous cycle, right? In some cases, because it allows us to provide more access or greater access to mobility if we can help supplement the cost of providing those services through the use of information for things like targeted advertising. But again, I understand that's a very sticky wicket in terms of responsibly doing that in such a way that doesn't ask of society to give up too much.
And the TV example I like because you have the choice there. This is one of the main things about most of the privacy laws. It's the choice. You have
That's
to
opt-in.
consent.
Opt-in, not
Absolutely.
opt-out.
But consent must be freely given. You can't feel you have to give consent. Otherwise, it's not consent. And I think, and a lot of the US laws are going the same way. And even the FCA today announced that they're looking at rules to do the proliferation of personal data for ad tech. And so I agree. Public, I don't think that we're going to solve the world's climate change problems with swapping diesel vehicles for electric vehicles that are exactly the same. Public transport is a good thing, and there is a lot of social cost to not having mobility outside of a private vehicle. But that feeling you have to be the product is where I get uncomfortable. That we are saying that for certain people who need it most because of poverty, they're the ones who are going to benefit, but they're the ones who have the least choice. And that's a really tricky balance to strike.
You know, I look at it. Yeah, I'm an engineer at heart at the end of the day, right? So everything ultimately is it's a cost benefit, right? And you know, for me, it's more of an issue of it's not strictly fairness, right? It's if that mechanism is not there, you know, what's the greater harm? Not being able to provide, you know, access to mobility, or requiring some level of, you know, targeted advertising, giving up of some level of personal data. I don't know. I think it's a very complicated, to your point, ethical decision that has to be made. I think if you ask the person, hey, by the way, we're going to sell out targeted advertising based on the fact that you ride this bus. If you want the bus to come down your street, you're probably okay with that. So to your point is, yeah, maybe that's a good frontier, is how do you start to message that, right, as part of the kind of use of public transportation, or the use of even just multi-passenger transportation. We've been talking about it purely in the public context, but we also have a lot of private deployments as well. So how do you drive that narrative as part of kind of the story and demonstrate the value of it? I think it's an interesting thing we'll have to explore. You know, again, it's not something we do today. It's kind of an interesting hypothesis we've made that if we, you know, given the cost of deploying technology today, if there's a means to provide some supplement to the underlying cost and improve the payback period for a public transit operator, yeah, we'd love to be able to do that. But, you know, again, I personally, just based on kind of maybe it's just selfishly based on where I live in Atlanta, and I've seen the resistance to public funding towards transportation. And I've also seen the other side of what happens when people don't have access to transportation. You know, it's an interesting thought exercise in terms of how you do that in a way to give people, it's not pure opt-in, to your point, but helping them understand the realities of the technology, what it means to them, how it impacts them by virtue of using the service. It's an interesting topic to explore.
Prime thing there is transparency, of course, which is always ironic when talking about anything with AI, because the one thing they tend to be is not as transparent as people like, but at the same time, that transparency, that being honest with people and making sure they have a choice. So
Yeah. Well, and I think what's interesting to me, and just in general, I think most people don't understand the layers of implications for it. Like, it's not just I receive certain ads. It's a lot more to it than that. And I even feel that way in regards to the TV decision, right? Like, you have two TVs, you make the decision for the cheaper one or the more expensive one, whichever direction you go. Either way, I think most consumers don't actually understand the depths of the psychological influence of that decision, and probably very much feel the benefits of the benefit, the positive side, which it makes it harder to even have the discussion, I think.
Yeah, based on the popularity and proliferation of TikTok, I have to absolutely agree.
Yeah.
People have no problem downloading, what is widely perceived as very entertaining spyware without a second thought, and devote hours and hours of time a day. It's a really interesting topic to talk about. How do you better educate people with respect to how they become a product, right? And the various touch
Oh,
points.
absolutely. It's my job to read privacy notices and notice what people are doing with your personal data. And some of them, even I read 4 or 5 times and go, I don't know what it is you're saying, which, by the way, means they failed on transparency. But if I don't always understand it, what on earth chance does your
That's a
average bus
feature.
user
It's a
have?
And
feature.
just even reading them, honestly. It's like,
Yeah,
no,
it's a
it's
feature.
reading them.
Oh, no, I always read them. Of
I
course I
know
do.
you do, but most people don't.
No, of course they don't.
Yeah.
I have, I have in fact
I'm not
sat on a
even.
bus with surveillance for an event, and I was the first person, and they had to do a disclaimer thing, and I read it. And firstly, everybody, including the tour operator, was fascinated that I read it because apparently I was the first person they'd come across. And secondly, everybody else on the bus just went what she said, sometimes verbatim.
It's interesting though, because there are always people out there that actually read the contract, right? I read release notes and I read end user licensing agreements when I download new editions of iOS, right? Apple has made an effort specifically on iOS to say, here's the privacy notice, right? Every single app has to have one. Here's what information this app has access to. Here's a link to their privacy policy. You should read it. People still don't read it. So, if we talk about, how do you dumb it down to the lowest degree to where people have a sense of ownership over it? I don't know if that's a solvable problem. So when we start to take a look at kind of our use cases specifically, and how do I inform a passenger, or how do I inform a member of community on what's happening and why? It's a very big problem. I don't think anyone's really tackled yet. Even though those folks are leading the way, like Apple is, but I think it's a really good example in terms of being transparent with respect to how third parties are using your data. If you have a solution there, I'd love to hear it.
Well, I was going to say, to me, it's
societal
fascinating.
challenge in general.
I was going to say, to me as a European, of course, it's interesting hearing you say that Apple is the exception because of where I live in GDPR, everybody does that. But of course, because everybody does that, you ignore it even more because then it's just like the whole, for terms and conditions. And now, over here, it's for terms and conditions and the privacy notice, please go to.
I mean, but do you think the average person cares what a data processor is, a data handler is? Like if you read those data policies, specifically the GDPR policies or GDPR compliant policies, they are very structured towards the regulatory language itself, right? So a normal person has no idea what that means. It's non-meaningful.
Those are
Totally.
those are badly done ones and actually technically breach the transparency aspect. So we're going to gloss over that. It is an interesting dilemma in the first place in that how to get people to understand, because most people don't. You're 100% correct. And when they do, then behavior starts to go, actually, I don't necessarily like this, or I understand it, it's still worth a balance. That understanding is the barrier, because then people get to say, I don't like this, or you know what, I'm comfortable with it. Some websites I turn off targeted ads, some websites I leave it on. I wish they knew that I'd already bought the pair of shoes to stop showing me them.
Yeah,
Right.
I
And
think as you
also,
pulled out, knowing's the hard part.
deciding. And so that to me, it's like it's so layered because
Yeah.
think it very much is involved in consent. You can't consent if you don't understand.
No, absolutely. And you're right on the interesting thing. So we've been focusing on privacy, and we know we're talking about mass mobility, which is a very important thing. And actually, that is the calculation. It's balancing what's good for an organization, what's good for society, what's good for the individuals, and then the different types of individual. Then balancing that with other aspects of human rights, making sure that you're not discriminating against certain types of people because of who is more likely to pay and who is less likely to pay. You're making sure that the overall good that you're doing balances all of that. And that is a complicated balance.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's difficult because if, I'm also very passionate about leaning in forward to technologies that help, like in this example of helping mass transportation because of the huge negative impacts it can have, and having good creative solutions to that problem is, in my mind, a testament to humanity. But then also knowing there's this nuance of difficulty in our ability to apply it in a way that's actually holistically ethical, and what that even means.
And that's I think the key word, holistically ethical, because yes, you have to strike a balance, but where is that balance, and how much are we making it on behalf of people versus letting them make it for themselves?
And how much can we? I mean, that's what I
And
ask.
how much can we? Absolutely.
If this question of understanding, to me, brings up the question of how much can you actually do that? Give it in their hands, everyone's hands. I don't know, personally.
Yeah, I mean, at a certain point, the holistic kind of full circle ethics, if you will, I think becomes to a degree an unsolvable problem, right? It frankly it just does, and maybe that's like my engineering centric reductive point of view, but I think in general at least our approach is to try to act in the best interest of first our customer, frankly, because that's my ultimate responsibility, is whoever's paying for what I provide. I need to deliver on their expectations, but
whoever's paying for what you provide is your customer. So under the scenario, the bus passenger is not your customer.
In this case, no, not necessarily. And that's maybe a nuance about how we operate today. So that's probably a separate podcast entirely. But if I think through like the public transit, like the typical public transportation providers customer, you're right. It's not just the passenger, it's the community they serve, right? It's those people that ride because they have no other option. It's those people that ride because it's convenient for certain use cases. And it's also those people that don't ride it because they have no interest in it, because they have an ingrained perception of what they perceive public transportation to be, right? Mm-hmm. And it's ultimately that transportation operators' responsibility to serve as many of those people as they can, right? Not just providing for those who have no other choice, but also, frankly, trying to provide a better experience to those who society would benefit from if they actually use transit. Less vehicles on the roadway, less emission, less carbon footprint, yada yada yada. And if that means requiring passengers to trade some amount of personal privacy in order to expand service, in order to provide a better vehicle experience, in order to provide a more reliable experience, I think there's a responsibility to look at it kind of to your point, from a complete point of view, right? It's not just if we can't meet all of these individual things, the technology is bad. I don't necessarily agree with that perspective, because again, it's what's the lesser of two evils. Not being able to provide someone access who needs the access because you frankly can't fund it, and society has decided it doesn't want to invest in it, or providing a pathway for them to do that. Now, again, we can talk about, is it meaningfully reasonable to enable a layman to understand everything that goes into the privacy decision? Probably not. So maybe an interesting thing, if I think about my last public transit experience, which was actually 2 weeks ago in the UK, there's you are being recorded signs everywhere, right? So maybe there's some kind of approach to that where it's you're being recorded, here's how your information is used, right? Some kind of brief, super reductive placard that could be put up to your point, provide people that insight. I don't know. I'm not a human factors expert. I have no idea how we distill a super complicated topic like this into a very contrite little placard, but I could see that being an evolution of how we go from here, right? Like, it's probably the next frontier that has to be studied. And how do you provide informed consent, right? For those not necessarily opt-in, but kind of opt-in by use cases.
Opt-in means affirmative action. So if you do something, then you are effectively opting in. It doesn't necessarily mean a tick box. But yeah, it's having the free choice to do so or not. And, don't get me wrong, I'm never going to say that bringing public transport to more people is bad. It's just an interesting conversation on how you fund it.
Sure. Yeah. And it's always going to be, again, I think it kind of talks back to perspectives, right? Based on kind of maybe your European centric point of view and the role of public transit in society versus the American point of view, and the fact that it's not consistent everywhere, right? Unfortunately, it's a very politicized topic of all around the world today. It's should you provide this type of service? Who pays for it? Why would we pay for it? Why there? Why not there? Ultimately, we believe that, again, autonomy can be a great advancement of public transportation use cases from a safety perspective, from a proliferation perspective.
Yeah.
And if we can identify other meaningful sources of revenue to help fund it, it becomes a virtuous cycle, right? It allows us to provide access in areas where we may not be able to. I don't think it's going to be solved anytime in the near future in terms of whether or not this is the right thing to do, the approach, but that's generally our perspective, is that we are invested in helping to ensure that people who need access to transportation mobility have it. And we're always going to be exploring ways to try to do that, to your point, responsibly. I'm not interested in monetizing everyone that walks on a vehicle. It is an amazing opportunity for us to further advance access and frankly vet out the reliability and kind of current state of the technology as today and as it will evolve in the next few years.
Well, I feel like we're kind of up on our time for today, but it's been a really great conversation, Clayton. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and talk with us. Super compelling conversation. I feel like I could talk about this for hours, honestly, on all fronts. Really appreciate you taking the time to come talk with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. It's always fun to I don't want to say argue, but engage with
Debate.
Sophie. Yeah, we'll say debate. Debate with Sophie on the privacy topic. It's always an interesting one.
Good. Wonderful. Well, for everyone listening, again, if you like what you hear and want to subscribe and receive these podcasts into your email, please just click the link and subscribe. And thanks for joining us today.
Thanks.
Thank you.